Hazel Winmere had spent 3 years perfecting the particular skill of surviving alone, tending her small garden, mending her own roof, and speaking to absolutely no one who might remind her that her own pack had once decided she wasn't worth keeping. On a rain-soaked evening in early autumn, she came across an enormous, heavily pregnant gray wolf already settled by her cottage fire. Hazel nearly jumped out of her skin, but seeing how frightened the wolf looked, she approached slowly. "Easy," Hazel murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you." The wolf's exhausted golden eyes tracked her carefully, wary but too spent to resist, as Hazel wrapped her in the driest blanket the cottage owned and settled her by the fire with a bowl of warm broth. She didn't know, that quiet evening, that the wolf belonged to anyone at all, let alone to a king. She found out 3 hours later, when the cottage door nearly came off its hinges beneath the weight of a man who filled the doorway entirely. Golden eyes scanning the room with a desperation that dissolved instantly into relief the moment he spotted the wolf curled safely by the fire. "Larkspur," he breathed, and something in his voice cracked entirely open. He was gone again within the hour. The pregnant wolf gathered gently into his arms. Hazel didn't expect to see him again. She was wrong. He returned that same night, not for Larkspur this time, but for her. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The knock came just past midnight, 3 sharp raps that made Hazel nearly drop the mug she'd been nursing by the dying fire, still turning over the strange, brief visit from the golden-eyed stranger who'd swept in, gathered up the wolf, and vanished again within the hour. She hadn't locked the door. There'd seemed little point, this far from the village, this far from anyone who'd bother making the walk simply to remind her she wasn't welcome among them. She opened it anyway, and found him standing there again. The same man, though considerably more composed than his earlier frantic arrival, rain still beating in his dark hair, golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her instinctively brace her hand against the doorframe. "You came back," she said, which seemed, given the circumstances, a reasonably obvious observation. "I did." He hesitated, something almost sheepish crossing his otherwise commanding features. "I realize I left abruptly. I didn't thank you, or introduce myself." "You said her name, Larkspur. I gathered you were more concerned with her than with introductions." "Fair," a faint, rueful smile. "Thorn Ashvale. King of the Ashvale territory, and in your debt, given that Larkspur is under my direct protection, and you're the reason she's currently resting safely rather than lost somewhere in that ditch." Hazel absorbed this with the particular flat calm she'd developed over 3 years of solitary living, largely because reacting to surprises required an audience she no longer had. "A king, standing on my porch, at midnight. I recognize how that sounds." "I don't think you do, but please continue." Something in his expression eased slightly at her dry tone, and he glanced past her, into the modest, fire-lit cottage, before returning his attention to her face. "May I come in? What I have to say is better suited to indoors than your doorstep." She let him in, mostly out of curiosity rather than any particular trust, and settled him across from her at the small kitchen table with a mug of tea he accepted more out of politeness than interest. "Larkspur's condition," he began, "isn't ordinary pregnancy. She's carrying pups marked by an old bloodline, magical significance to my territory, tied to an ancient blessing my family's protected for generations. She wandered off during a routine walk, further than her handlers anticipated, and became trapped in that ditch before anyone realized she was missing. That explains why you were so relieved to find her. It doesn't explain why you're back here at my kitchen table, past midnight." Thorne studied her for a long moment, something considering in his golden gaze. You pulled a heavily pregnant wolf out of freezing mud without knowing anything about her significance, expecting nothing in return. That's rarer than you'd think, in my experience. Most people, learning what she represents, immediately begin calculating what reward or advantage they might extract. I didn't know what she represented when I pulled her out. I only knew she was drowning. Precisely my point. Something warm entered his expression. I'd like to repay that kindness, Miss Winmere, Hazel Winmere. Miss Winmere, whatever you require, whatever this modest cottage might benefit from, I'm prepared to provide it, not as empty royal courtesy. Hazel considered this, old wariness warring with practical need she'd spent 3 years refusing to acknowledge, even to herself. I don't need charity, Your Majesty. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering gratitude, which is rather a different thing. He glanced around the cottage's modest interior, patched walls, a roof she'd repaired herself with mixed success, the particular bare simplicity of someone managing alone on very little. Though I confess, looking around, I suspect gratitude and need aren't so far apart in your particular case. Something in Hazel's chest tightened, old shame rising despite her best effort to remain composed. I manage well enough. I don't doubt your capability, Miss Winmere. I simply notice as a matter of observation rather than judgment that managing and thriving aren't always the same thing. She should have argued further. She'd built pride around not needing anyone's help these past 3 years, ever since her own pack had decided, with careful cruelty dressed as concern, that an Omega who preferred solitude and animals to pack socializing represented more trouble than she was worth. But something in Thorne's steady, unhurried patience made argument feel less necessary than it usually did. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked instead. "You have your wolf back, safe and sound. You could return to your territory and consider the debt settled with a polite word of thanks." "I could," he agreed, "though I find myself, having met you, rather unwilling to leave it there." "That's not an answer." "No," he admitted, something almost surprised in his own voice, as though he were working through the reasoning himself for the first time. "I suppose it isn't. I think, honestly, it's simply that you remind me of Larkspur, in a way. Something valuable that's been left to fend for itself, managing better than circumstance ever allowed, without anyone bothering to notice how much strength that requires." Hazel felt something in her chest crack slightly at that, unexpected and unwelcome, and busied herself with her own cooling tea rather than examine the feeling. "That's a generous comparison, coming from a king who's known me for exactly 1 evening." "I contain multitudes of generous comparisons. Apparently," Thorne said, something dry and warm entering his voice that made her glance up despite herself, catching the faint humor in his expression, "though I suspect you'll need more evidence before trusting any of them." "Considerably more," Hazel agreed, though her own mouth had begun, treacherously, to curve into something like a smile. It was old Fen, arriving unannounced the following morning with his usual excuse of checking on the fence line, who interrupted whatever careful, cautious conversation Hazel and Thorne had continued deep into the previous night, the elderly farmer's eyebrows climbing toward his thinning hairline at the sight of an unfamiliar, well-dressed man still seated at Hazel's kitchen table. "Well," old Fen said, leaning heavily on his walking stick, Mustard the goat trailing behind him with characteristic stubborn disinterest in anyone's business but her own. "I didn't expect company, girl. Should I be worried, or should I be fetching a congratulatory bottle from my cellar?" "Neither, Fen. This is King Thorne Ashvale. He's here about the wolf I pulled from the ditch last night." "A king?" Old Fen studied Thorne with open, unabashed curiosity, entirely unbothered by royal presence in the way only decades of rural isolation could produce. "Well, that explains the fine coat at least. Though I confess it doesn't explain why a king's still sitting in this kitchen come morning." "We were discussing repayment for Miss Winmere's kindness," Thorne said, something amused in his expression at the old farmer's blunt curiosity. "Repayment, is it?" Old Fenn's weathered face carried a knowing look that made Hazel's cheeks heat slightly. Well, don't let an old man interrupt royal business then. Mustard and I only came to check the fence. Mustard, entirely uninterested in fences, wandered directly into the cottage and began investigating the contents of Hazel's kitchen with the thorough disregard for boundaries that had made her something of a local legend. "Your goat," Thorne observed, watching Mustard attempt to eat a corner of his coat sleeve with visible interest, "seems to share your directness." "She's got no manners whatsoever," Old Fenn said, though his tone carried nothing but fond pride. "Learned it from spending too much time around this one, I'd wager, given how little patience Hazel's ever had for pretense." Once Old Fenn had finally departed, Mustard reluctantly dragged along behind him. Thorne turned back to Hazel with renewed seriousness. "I meant what I said last night," he said. "Whatever you need, I intend to provide it. But I confess I've been considering something further this morning that I'd like to propose." "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous. Significant." He held her gaze steadily. "Larkspur's pups will need care once they arrive. Handling, attention, given their significance to my territory's old blessing. I find myself watching how naturally you handled her last night despite never having encountered anything like her before, wondering whether you might consider joining my household. Not as a servant, but as Larkspur's dedicated caretaker, with compensation and respect for your considerable skill." Hazel stared at him, old caution warring with something that felt, disconcertingly, like hope. "You're offering me a position, based on one evening's rescue. I'm offering you a position based on demonstrated skill, kindness, and my own instinct that you'd manage the role well." Something warmer entered his expression. "I won't pretend the offer's uncomplicated by other considerations, but the professional offer stands regardless, whatever else might or might not develop alongside it." Hazel turned the offer over carefully. 3 years of solitude warring with the particular ache of loneliness she'd spent effort pretending not to feel. "I'd need to think about it. Take whatever time you need. I'm not attempting to rush you." Thorne rose, something reluctant in the movement despite his evident need to return to his own territory and Larkspur's continued care. "Though I confess, Miss Winmere, I find myself rather hoping you'll say yes." He left shortly after, promising to send formal word within the week, and Hazel stood alone in her cottage's doorway long after his horse had disappeared down the muddy lane, turning over the strange, sudden possibility of a life less solitary than the one she'd built these past 3 years, uncertain, hopeful, and for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, curious about what might come next. That evening she found herself sitting by the fire with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, attempting to weigh the decision the way she'd once weighed every difficult choice, listing what she stood to lose against what she might hope to gain. Lose. The quiet she'd built so carefully. The predictable rhythm of days that answered to no one. The safety of never again being told by anyone with authority that she wasn't wanted. Gain. She stopped there, pencil hovering, and found the second list harder to fill. Company, perhaps. Purpose beyond simple survival. The particular unfamiliar warmth of being asked rather than dismissed, valued rather than tolerated. She thought of Larkspur's exhausted golden eyes, trusting her despite having no reason to. She thought of Thorne's steady patience at her kitchen table, offering nothing that felt like pity, only considered respect. "You're being ridiculous," she told the empty cottage, setting the pencil down with more force than necessary. "It's one evening's acquaintance, Hazel. Don't build an entire life around a king's kind words and a wolf's grateful eyes." The cottage, predictably, offered no argument either way. She fell asleep that night, still turning the decision over, and woke the following morning with something she hadn't felt in 3 long years. Not certainty, but the cautious, unfamiliar shape of hope, refusing to be dismissed as her careful solitude usually managed. The formal word arrived 4 days later. more elaborate than Hazel had expected. A sealed letter carried by an anxious young rider who clearly hadn't anticipated his delivery route, including quite so isolated a hillside cottage. Miss Windermere, I hope this finds you well, and that the intervening days have offered space to consider my proposal without pressure. Larkspur asks after you daily, in whatever manner a wolf manages to ask after anyone. I confess I do as well, rather more than professional courtesy requires. Whatever you decide, please know the offer stands regardless of timeline. Thorn Hazel read it twice, something warm settling in her chest at the small, unnecessary admission tucked into an otherwise formal letter, and found herself, before she'd finished considering the matter, already reaching for parchment to draft her reply. She arrived at Ashvale territory 8 days later, her modest belongings packed into a single trunk that felt almost embarrassingly small compared to the grand stone walls rising ahead of her, and found Thorn waiting personally at the gate, despite what she assumed must be royal business demanding his attention elsewhere. You came, he said, echoing his own earlier words back at her with visible, unguarded pleasure. You did ask rather nicely, in the end. Hazel glanced up at the imposing keep, old nerves resurfacing despite her considered decision. Though I confess I'm already regretting how small my trunk looks against all this stone. Your trunk's fine. It's what's inside it that matters, and I suspect that's worth more than any amount of stone. He offered his arm, something formal and careful in the gesture that made her chest tighten pleasantly. Come. Larkspur's been asking after you rather insistently. I believe she's decided you're now formally part of her pack, whether either of us agreed to the arrangement or not. Larkspur, when they finally reached the warm, straw-lined den prepared for her comfort, greeted Hazel with an enthusiasm that startled her, pressing her great head against Hazel's legs with a low, happy whine, tail thumping steadily against the ground. She remembers you, Thorn said, something soft in his voice watching the reunion. I only met her once, and mostly while dragging her out of a ditch. Apparently, that's sufficient grounds for lifelong loyalty in Larkspur's particular accounting. Thorn knelt beside the wolf, running a careful hand along her rounder belly. The healers say she's close now. Days, perhaps a week at most. That soon? Wolf gestation moves differently than human timelines suggest. She's been carrying since before you found her, further along than her wandering that evening should have allowed for. He glanced up at Hazel, something warm and slightly nervous in his expression. I'd like you present when her time comes, if you're willing. She trusts you already, more thoroughly than she trusts most of my household staff after longer acquaintance. I'd be honored. The following days settled into a rhythm Hazel found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, enjoying. Mornings spent learning the routines of Larkspur's care alongside the territory's senior healer, a brisk, no-nonsense woman named Bramble, who took an immediate, approving liking to Hazel's practical competence, and afternoons that increasingly, without any particular planning on either side, found her in Thorn's company. You're better at this than most trained handlers I've employed, Bramble observed one afternoon, watching Hazel coax Larkspur into a comfortable resting position with gentle patience. Where'd you learn such a natural touch with creatures this significant? I didn't, particularly. I simply spent 3 years alone with only animals for company. You learn a lot about patience, when conversation isn't really an option. Something in Bramble's weathered expression softened at that admission. Lonely years, I'd guess, from the way you say it. Considerably lonely, yes, though I've stopped minding the admission quite so much these past few days. Good, Bramble said simply, returning to her own careful work. This territory could use a bit more of your particular loneliness turned into something useful. We've had rather too much guarded solitude around here ourselves since the old queen passed. It was Thorn himself who found her that evening, settled on a low garden wall overlooking Larkspur's den, watching the sunset paint the territory's hills in familiar gold that reminded her unexpectedly of her own abandoned cottage's evening light. Homesick? He asked, settling beside her. A little, Though I confess this place has started feeling less foreign than I expected, this quickly. I'm glad. He was quiet a moment, something careful in his expression. May I ask you something, Hazel? Rather more personal than professional matters require. You may. What happened with your original pack? You've mentioned loneliness, mentioned being alone these past 3 years, but never quite the circumstance behind it. Hazel considered the question, old grief and old anger both settling familiar and worn beneath her composed exterior. I preferred animals to people, mostly. Still do, if I'm honest. My pack decided that preference made me strange, unsuitable for pack life. An omega who'd rather tend injured foxes than attend social gatherings, who found more comfort in silence than in pack politics. They didn't formally reject me. They simply made it clear over time that I'd always remain something of an outsider, regardless of how hard I tried to belong. So you left. So I left, eventually. Built my own quiet life instead, where at least the loneliness was honest rather than dressed up as belonging I never actually had. She glanced at him, something vulnerable in the admission she hadn't planned on making. I didn't expect, arriving here, that Larkspur's trust alone would make me feel more welcome than 3 entire years among my own supposed pack ever managed. Something fierce and protective flickered across Thorn's expression. Your former pack failed you then. Whatever discomfort your particular gifts caused them, the failure belongs entirely to their limited imagination, not to any deficiency in you. That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness. It's accurate observation. He took her hand, careful and questioning, and when she didn't pull away, something warm and relieved crossed his features. I find myself these past days increasingly certain that whatever debt I originally intended to repay has grown into something more significant than simple gratitude. Hazel's breath caught, old caution warring gently with the accumulated warmth of these past days. That's rather forward, Your Majesty, for someone who's known me barely 2 weeks. I contain multitudes of forward observations, apparently, he said, echoing words she vaguely recalled offering him herself, and the familiar dry humor pulled a genuine surprised laugh from her despite the moment's tender weight. I'll allow the forwardness this once, she said, provided you don't expect me to reciprocate with equal speed. I'd never dream of rushing you, Hazel. I find myself content simply to wait, for however long trust requires. It was 3 nights later, well past midnight, that Bramble's urgent knocking woke Hazel from a restless sleep, the healer's expression carrying none of her usual brisk composure. It's time, Bramble said. Larkspur's begun. This time, not simply practicing. Hazel was dressed and moving within minutes, finding Thorn already at Larkspur's den when she arrived, his own composure carrying visible, barely restrained anxiety, despite his best effort to remain steady for the wolf's sake. How is she? Frightened, mostly. Though Bramble assures me that's entirely ordinary. Thorn glanced at Hazel, something relieved settling into his expression at her arrival. She's been asking for you, in whatever way she manages to ask for anything. I believe your presence steadies her more than anything else currently available. Hazel knelt beside Larkspur immediately, murmuring the same low, steady reassurance she'd once offered dying foxes and frightened lambs, and felt the wolf's tension ease fractionally at her familiar voice and touch. I'm here, she said softly. We're both here. Whatever comes next, you're not facing it alone. Larkspur's tail thumped once, weak but grateful, and settled into the demanding work ahead with Hazel's steady presence anchoring her through every difficult hour that followed. Dawn broke soft and gold over the territory by the time the den finally settled into quiet, exhausted peace. 5 small, healthy pups nursing contentedly against Larkspur's side, the wolf herself utterly spent, but radiating the particular boneless satisfaction of a mother who had done the hardest work of her life and could finally rest. 5, Bramble said, voice rough with her own relief, wiping her hands on a clean cloth. 5 healthy, strong pups. I've delivered litters in my years, and rarely one this smooth, given how significant this bloodline runs. That's your doing, Thorne said quietly to Hazel, watching the pups settle with visible, unguarded wonder. Whatever calm Larkspur found through the difficult hours, it came from you standing steady beside her. It came from all of us. You never once left either, whatever anxious pacing I noticed you doing near the doorway. I wasn't so calming a presence as you, I assure you. Mostly I just worried, rather uselessly, while you did the steadying work. Hazel studied the 5 small pups, already marveling at how quickly the night's fear had dissolved into this quiet, golden morning of new life, and felt something settle fully into place in her chest. Not satisfaction at a difficult task completed, but something warmer, more permanent, that she suspected had been building steadily these past 2 weeks, without her quite naming it until this exact moment. "They're beautiful," she said softly. "They are," Thorne agreed, though his gaze, she noticed, had drifted toward her rather than the pups themselves. Beautiful and safely arrived, and entirely because a stranger once chose kindness over convenient indifference, pulling a drowning wolf from a ditch without asking what reward that kindness might bring. Hazel felt her cheeks warm at the weight in his voice and reached instinctively for his hand, finding it already reaching for hers in return, both of them watching the pups settle into their mother's protective warmth as the morning light strengthened around them, golden and full of quiet, hard-won promise. News of Larkspur's safe delivery spread through Ashvale territory within a day, and Hazel found herself, over the following week, the subject of more curious attention than her quiet years of solitary living had prepared her for. "You're famous, apparently," Bramble informed her, arriving with the morning's supplies and visible amusement at Hazel's evident discomfort with the notion. "The Omega who calmed the sacred litter's difficult birth. I've heard no fewer than 3 embellished versions already, one of which apparently involves you singing the pups into the world." "I didn't sing anything. I mostly just talked to Larkspur the way I'd talk to any frightened creature." Bramble laughed despite herself, watching the 5 pups tumble over each other in their den, already displaying distinct personalities barely a week into their small lives, one bold and constantly wandering toward whatever mischief presented itself, one quiet and watchful, content to observe from Larkspur's protective shadow. "They're doing wonderfully," she said. "They are, thanks largely to your continued attention." Bramble's expression turned more serious. "Though I should mention, since you'll hear it eventually, the council's begun discussing your position here more pointedly than simple staff gossip usually warrants." Something cold settled in Hazel's stomach. "What kind of discussing?" "The kind that involves questioning whether an unranked Omega, however skilled with the sacred litter's care, belongs this close to the king's daily company." The formal summons arrived the following afternoon. "You don't have to attend alone," Thorne said, finding her nervously reviewing it in Larkspur's den. "I'd rather stand on my own merit. If the council has concerns about my position here, I'd like the chance to address them myself." "That's remarkably brave." "I've faced worse than a skeptical council, Your Majesty. I raised myself alone for 3 years." The council chamber proved more intimidating than Hazel had braced herself for. "You arrived here as an unranked stranger," a sharp-featured advisor said, "and within a matter of weeks find yourself intimately involved in both the sacred litter's care and, if palace gossip proves accurate, the king's personal attention as well. Such rapid elevation raises legitimate questions." "I understand the concern," Hazel said, "though I'd point out that my involvement with Larkspur began through simple chance. I found her drowning and pulled her free, without any knowledge of her significance or any calculation about what advantage that rescue might provide. Convenient timing, nonetheless. Life rarely arranges itself around convenient timing. In my experience, I didn't choose when or where to encounter a drowning wolf. I simply chose not to walk past her suffering, which seems to me a more relevant measure of character than the timing's convenience. Several council members exchanged surprised glances at her direct response. Thorne, seated at the chamber's head, finally spoke himself. I'd add that Miss Winmere's care proved instrumental in Larkspur's safe delivery. Whatever questions this council carries about her formal standing, her demonstrated competence and character speak louder than any concern about convenient timing. With respect, Your Majesty, the concern isn't solely about competence. It's about precedent. Then let the council consider it. I won't pretend my regard for Miss Winmere remains purely professional. I'd ask that concern be weighed against actual demonstrated character, rather than simple assumption about what her background implies. The formal deliberation concluded an hour later, more favorably than Hazel had dared hope, the council extending provisional approval, with continued standing based on demonstrated merit rather than royal favor alone. That's fair, Hazel said, once alone with Thorne in the corridor beyond. I'd rather earn continued trust than have it handed over. You handled that better than most formally trained diplomats manage. I meant what I said in there, he said quietly. About my regard for you extending beyond professional respect. I'd like to court you, Hazel. Whatever pace feels right to you, I'm willing to follow it. Hazel studied him for a long moment, old caution finally giving way to something she'd stopped believing herself capable of feeling again these past 3 solitary years. I think I'd like that very much, Thorne. His answering smile carried the same warmth she'd first glimpsed that midnight doorstep visit weeks earlier, and when he leaned in to press a gentle, questioning kiss to her lips, Hazel found herself leaning into it fully, 3 years of solitude finally giving way to something warmer and more hopeful than she'd allowed herself to imagine wanting again. Old Fen arrived unannounced 3 days later, having apparently decided the distance between his farm and Ashvale territory was no excuse for missing whatever gossip-worthy developments had unfolded since Hazel's departure. Mustard trotting along beside his cart with characteristic stubborn disinterest in the journey's length. Well, he announced, taking in the grand keep with open, unimpressed appraisal, you've landed yourself somewhere grander than that leaky cottage girl, though I confess the goat's not impressed. She's seen bigger barns. Fen? Hazel embraced him warmly, delight at the familiar, gruff presence amid so much unfamiliar grandeur. I didn't expect you to travel all this way. Someone had to check whether royalty was treating you decently, given how thoroughly the whole territory's been buzzing about a king's sudden, dramatic courtship of some unranked stranger. Thorne, arriving in time to catch this exchange, extended his hand with warmth. Mr. Fen, I presume. Hazel's spoken of you often. Has she? Fen studied him with open, unbothered scrutiny. Well, you look less exhausted than the last time I saw you standing in her kitchen at midnight. I'll take that as a good sign. A very good sign, I hope, Thorne said, something amused entering his formal composure. You're welcome to stay as long as you'd like, both you and Mustard, provided she doesn't attempt to eat anything ceremonially significant. No promises, Fen said cheerfully, watching Mustard already investigate a nearby hedge with predatory interest. Hazel, watching her old, gruff friend settle easily into her new life's unfamiliar grandeur, felt something warm and grateful settle fully into place. Proof, however small, she needn't leave behind every piece of the quiet, hard-won life she'd built before it. Fen's visit stretched into a full week, longer than either he or Hazel had planned, though neither seemed inclined to hurry the departure. Fen finding endless entertainment critiquing the palace's formal gardens against his own practical farming standards, and Mustard, somewhat alarmingly, striking up an unlikely friendship with one of the palace's more dignified peacocks. That bird's going to regret this association eventually, Bramble observed, watching Mustard and the peacock investigate the kitchen garden together with matched, destructive enthusiasm. Probably, Hazel agreed, though she found herself laughing rather than concerned. Though I confess I've stopped trying to predict Mustard's social choices. She does exactly as she pleases, regardless of species or station. Rather like someone else I've recently gotten to know, Bramble said, something knowing in her expression that made Hazel's cheeks warm slightly. It was Advocate Stern, the sharp-featured council member who'd pressed her most pointedly during the formal deliberation, who sought Hazel out directly during Fenn's visit, finding her alone in Larkspur's den one quiet afternoon while Thorne attended to formal territorial business elsewhere. "Miss Winmere," he said, settling nearby with careful, formal politeness that carried, beneath its surface courtesy, something more probing. "Advocate Stern, I confess I didn't expect a private visit, given our last formal exchange. I wanted to clarify something, away from the council chamber's more theatrical pressures." He studied her carefully. "My concern was never about your character, Miss Winmere. I found your defense rather compelling. My concern runs deeper, regarding matters you likely haven't been informed of yet." Something cautious settled in Hazel's chest. "What kind of matters?" "The sacred bloodline Larkspur carries," Stern said carefully, "isn't simply ceremonial significance. It's tied to an old prophecy regarding this territory's continued prosperity. Specifically, that the bloodline's caretaker, whoever earns that trust, carries binding obligations to this territory that extend beyond simple employment." "What kind of obligations?" "Formal permanent commitment, Miss Winmere. Once the prophecy's caretaker role is formally accepted, through certain ceremonial rites the sacred texts describe, that commitment cannot be easily undone. You'd be bound to this territory's welfare, and, by extension, to whatever future the Crown's line requires, for the remainder of your life." Hazel absorbed this slowly, old caution resurfacing despite weeks of gradually building trust. Does Thorne know this? About the binding nature of the role? I believe he does, though I confess I'm uncertain whether he's explained the full weight of it to you directly, given how quickly his personal regard for you seems to have developed alongside your professional appointment. Stern's expression carried something almost sympathetic beneath its formal caution. "I don't say this to frighten you, Miss Winmere. I say it because I believe you deserve full information before any further formal ceremony binds you to obligations you haven't been given fair chance to understand." Hazel found Thorne that evening in his private study, old questions weighing heavier than she'd anticipated. "Advocate Stern visited me today," she said without preamble. "He mentioned something about binding prophecy, formal ceremonial rites tied to Larkspur's bloodline. Is that true?" Something complicated crossed Thorne's expression, not quite guilt, but adjacent to it. "It's true. I should have explained it sooner rather than letting you learn it secondhand through Stern's less generous framing." "Why didn't you?" "Because I was afraid," Thorne admitted, voice rough with honesty. "Afraid that explaining the full binding weight of the role too soon might frighten you away, before you'd had chance to fall in love with this place. I wanted you to choose this life because you wanted it, not because formal obligation demanded it. That's not your decision to make for me, Thorne. Withholding information because you feared my response isn't protection. It's simply a different kind of dishonesty. You're right. I handled that poorly, and I'm sorry. I should have trusted you with the complete truth from the beginning." Thorne explained carefully, methodically, laying out every detail: the formal ceremony required to accept the caretaker's role, the permanent nature of the commitment once accepted, the way it would tie her, formally and magically, to Ashvel's continued welfare for the remainder of her life. "I don't require you to accept it," he said finally. "You could remain here informally without ever undergoing the formal binding. Or you could leave entirely if this proves more commitment than you're prepared to offer. So, if I don't accept it, eventually, this territory suffers for my hesitation." "Eventually, yes, though more slowly than dramatic prophecy usually suggests. I won't pretend that reality doesn't create its own pressure. I'd rather you know it plainly, though, than continue operating under incomplete information." Hazel found Fenn in the guest quarters, Mustard already asleep near the fireplace, and settled across from him with the need for outside perspective only old friendship could provide. She explained the binding prophecy carefully, watching Fenn's weathered face carry thoughtful consideration throughout. "Do you love him?" he asked finally. "Beyond simply enjoying his company these past weeks? I think I do, Fenn. More than I expected to feel again." "Then perhaps the question isn't whether the commitment frightens you. Perhaps it's whether you'd rather face that fear alongside love, or retreat back into familiar loneliness simply because permanence feels safer than risk." "Someone has to, girl. I've watched you build walls these past years, protecting yourself from further hurt. I'd simply hate to watch you build one final wall right at the threshold of something worth risking everything for." Hazel spent the following days turning the decision over, deliberately avoiding Thorne's company more than necessary, while she worked through her own tangled feelings. She found herself, on the third day, sitting quietly beside Larkspur's den, watching the 5 pups tumble through their late morning play, and felt something settle clearly into place as she studied their small, trusting faces. "You didn't ask to be born into prophecy either," she told them softly, "any more than I asked to fall in love with your father, or this whole complicated, wonderful territory." Larkspur's tail thumped once, as though offering her own opinion on the matter, and Hazel laughed despite herself, old tension finally easing as clarity settled into place. She found Thorne in the same garden where he'd first asked to court her, watching the sunset with visible, careful worry that eased the moment he spotted her approaching. "I've decided," she said, without preamble. "Whatever you decide, Let me finish, please, before you talk yourself into some anxious apology I don't need." Hazel settled beside him, taking his hand with steady certainty. "I've spent 3 days weighing fear against feeling, Thorne, and I find myself, having done that difficult work, certain that I'd rather risk permanent commitment alongside love than retreat into familiar solitude, simply because permanence frightens me." Something in his expression broke open with relief and joy in equal measure. "You're certain?" "Entirely certain. I'll accept the formal binding, Thorne, not because obligation demands it, but because I've chosen it, with full understanding of everything it requires." His answering smile carried such complete, unguarded happiness that Hazel felt her own chest ache with matching joy. And when he pulled her into a fierce, grateful embrace, she found herself laughing through unexpected tears, old caution finally giving way to the considerable, hard-won certainty of a choice made entirely her own. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. "For choosing this, for choosing me, with full knowledge of what that choice requires. Thank you for finally trusting me with the complete truth," Hazel said softly, "rather than deciding for me what I could handle." "I won't make that particular mistake again," Thorne promised, pulling back just enough to meet her eyes. "Whatever comes next, permanent commitment included, we face it together, with complete honesty between us." "Together," Hazel agreed, and found, watching the sunset paint the territory gold around them, that the word had never once felt so completely true. The formal binding ceremony, once scheduled, required preparation Hazel hadn't anticipated. Weeks of careful study under an elderly territorial scholar named Master Aldrich, who guided her through the sacred texts explaining the prophecy's origins with patient attention. "The bloodline dates back 6 generations," Master Aldrich explained one afternoon, spreading ancient illustrations across his study table, each page depicting a different caretaker in faded ink. "Each caretaker's binding has strengthened this territory's prosperity in different ways. One focused on agricultural abundance, another on peaceful diplomatic relations with neighboring territories, a third, rather memorably, on improvement to the territory's mining yields. Though the scholarly record's vague on how animal affinity produced that particular outcome. What gifts do you suppose mine might strengthen? Given your demonstrated skill with creatures others find difficult or frightening, I'd wager improvement in this territory's relationship with its wilder borders." The forest creatures, the less domesticated bloodlines who've kept distance from formal settlement. Master Aldrich's weathered face carried scholarly interest. You may find, once bound, that your particular affinity extends beyond simple wolves and pups. The binding has a way of amplifying whatever gift the caretaker already carries. That's rather a significant responsibility to carry. It is. Though I'd remind you, Lady Winmere-to-be, that responsibility and burden aren't always the same thing. Several previous caretakers described the binding as more gift than obligation, once settled into it. The weeks of preparation demanded more of Hazel's attention than she'd initially expected. Memorizing the ceremony's ancient language, learning the ritual gestures Master Aldrich insisted mattered as much as the words themselves, and sitting through countless formal briefings regarding the binding's exact legal and magical implications. "You're allowed to find this tedious," Bramble told her one exhausted afternoon, finding Hazel slumped over a stack of ceremonial texts with visible fatigue. "I've watched numbers of formal court preparations in my years here. Nobody enjoys the actual studying, whatever excitement waits at the ceremony's conclusion. I don't mind the tedium. I simply want to understand everything before I commit. I've made enough decisions in my life based on incomplete information. I'd rather not add this one to that list." "Wise instinct," Bramble said approvingly, settling beside her with a fresh pot of tea. "Though I'll say this, having watched you these past weeks, you've already demonstrated more understanding of what this binding actually requires than most caretakers manage before their formal ceremony. Master Aldrich's mentioned as much himself, more than once." Stern, somewhat to Hazel's continued surprise, became an unexpected ally during these preparatory weeks, his earlier skepticism having transformed into genuine, careful support once her decision was made plain. "I owe you an apology," he admitted one afternoon, finding her during a break in her studies, settling across from her with visible, careful discomfort. "My initial questioning came from concern, certainly, but I confess I also carried some old bias about unranked omegas generally, which I've since reconsidered." "I appreciate the honesty, Advocate Stern. I've watched you these past weeks, the council chamber, Larkspur's difficult birth, your careful, thoughtful decision regarding the binding itself. I find myself, having witnessed all of it, satisfied that this territory's prophecy has found precisely the right caretaker." His formal composure carried warmth. "I intend to formally support your binding before the full council, if that carries any weight toward easing whatever nerves remain." "It carries weight, actually. Thank you. I'd add one further thing, if you'll permit an old advocate's unsolicited advice." Stern's expression turned thoughtful. "Whatever formal weight this binding carries, don't let the ceremony's solemnity convince you that you're accepting a cage rather than a home. I've watched previous caretakers approach the role with dread, treating it as sacrifice rather than partnership, and their bindings, I confess, never seem to settle quite so easily as I suspect yours will." "That's rather perceptive, for a man who spent our first meeting questioning my basic worthiness." "I contain occasional flashes of insight." "Lady Winmere, despite my earlier limitations," something almost warm crossed his usually formal expression, "I look forward to watching this territory flourish under your particular care." The night before the ceremony, unable to sleep despite exhaustion from weeks of study, Hazel found herself walking the palace grounds alone, eventually settling near Larkspur's den where the wolf and her grown pups slept peacefully in the cool evening air. "Tomorrow," she murmured to the sleeping wolf, though Larkspur showed no sign of waking. "I keep waiting to feel more frightened than I actually do. I think perhaps that means I've made the right decision." She sat with them a long while, watching moonlight silver the den's quiet interior, and found herself thinking back through the entire remarkable journey that had led her here. The rain-soaked evening she'd pulled a drowning wolf from the mud, the midnight knock that had changed everything, the careful trust built through weeks of shared work and honest conversation. "I never expected any of this," she admitted softly, to no one in particular. 3 years ago, I'd convinced myself solitude was simply my permanent fate. I'm rather glad now that fate had other plans. Thorn found her there an hour later, having apparently guessed correctly where her restless thoughts might lead her the night before such significant ceremony. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, settling beside her. "Too much anticipation. Not fear, exactly. Anticipation. I understand that feeling well. I confess I've been rehearsing my own formal remarks for tomorrow's ceremony more times than necessary, mostly to keep my hands occupied rather than reaching for you at every opportunity, which Master Aldrich informed me would be considered improper before the bindings formally complete." Hazel laughed softly, leaning into his shoulder despite whatever formal propriety Master Aldrich might object to. "One more night of impropriety won't undo months of careful courtship, I imagine." "I sincerely hope not," Thorn said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple as they settled into comfortable silence, watching the moon travel slowly across the territory that would, by tomorrow's end, be formally and permanently hers. The ceremony itself, held on a clear, crisp morning 3 weeks after Hazel's decision, drew more formal witnesses than she'd anticipated. The full council, Bramble and the household staff who'd grown fond of her these past weeks, and, to her particular delight, Old Fen and Mustard, who'd extended their visit specifically to witness the significant occasion. "You look terrified," Fen observed, finding her in the private chamber where she'd dressed for the formal proceedings, her ceremonial robes grander than anything she'd ever imagined wearing during her 3 solitary years of farm management. "I am, rather, though less terrified than I was 3 weeks ago before I'd decided." "That's the difference between fear you're choosing to face and fear that's simply happening to you, girl. I'd wager you'll manage the ceremony rather well, given how thoroughly you've already managed everything else this territory's thrown at you." The ceremony proceeded with ancient formality, Master Aldrich leading the ritual's precise language, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled chamber as he invoked 6 generations of prior caretakers by name, each syllable weighted with accumulated significance. Larkspur herself was present with her 5 pups, their small presence lending the proceedings an unexpected warmth that softened the ceremony's solemn weight. Hazel spoke the binding's ancient words carefully, feeling something shift and settle deep within her as the ceremony reached its formal completion. Not overwhelming, not frightening, but simply a quiet, permanent rightness settling into place, like a key finally turning in a lock built specifically for it. "It's done," Master Aldrich announced, something reverent in his weathered voice. "The binding's accepted. Miss Windmere, Lady Windmere now by the prophecy's own formal designation, is permanently joined to this territory's continued welfare." The pups, sensing the ceremony's conclusion, immediately abandoned whatever patience they'd managed throughout the formal proceedings, tumbling toward Hazel with enthusiastic joy that broke the chamber's remaining formal tension into laughter. "They approve," Thorn said, watching the pups climb over Hazel's formal ceremonial robes with complete disregard for the garment's dignity. "They approve of anyone who occasionally sneaks them extra treats," Hazel said, laughing as the bold one, she'd taken to calling him Bramble the Younger, much to the actual Bramble's fond amusement, attempted to climb directly into her lap. Larkspur, watching this chaos with placid satisfaction, pressed her great head against Hazel's side, and Hazel felt fresh emotion rise at the wolf's complete trust. The same trust that had begun this entire remarkable journey, months earlier, in a rain-soaked ditch behind her old, abandoned cottage. "Thank you," she murmured to the wolf, scratching gently behind one ear, "for trusting a stranger that first night. I don't believe I'd have found any of this without your stubbornness getting stuck in that ditch." Larkspur's tail thumped once, as though accepting the gratitude with characteristic wolf dignity. And the assembled witnesses, watching this quiet exchange, offered their own warm applause at the ceremony's touching conclusion. That evening, with the formal celebration finally winding down and the palace settling into peaceful quiet, Thorn found Hazel in the same garden, where so much of their courtship's significant moments had already unfolded. "How does it feel?" he asked, settling beside her. "Permanently bound to this place now. Less frightening than I expected. More like finally arriving somewhere I was always meant to be, rather than simply accepting obligation." Hazel leaned into his shoulder, watching the stars emerge over the territory that was now, formally and permanently, her own home. "I keep thinking about that first night, pulling larkspur from the ditch, having no idea what chaos that single choice would eventually bring. I think about that often myself, how close I came to losing her entirely, before your stubborn kindness intervened." Thorn took her hand, something warm and certain in his golden eyes. "I find myself, watching you settle into this life these past months, convinced that whatever prophecy originally bound this territory's fortune to a caretaker's gift, it couldn't have anticipated someone quite so remarkable as you." "That's generous, Your Majesty." "It's simply accurate," he said, echoing words she'd once offered him herself, and the familiar exchange pulled a laugh from her that cut cleanly through the evening's remaining formal weight. "I love you," she said softly, the words arriving easily now after months of trust finally settling into certainty. "Completely, whatever formal binding ceremony made official today." "I love you too," Thorn said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple as the stars strengthened overhead. "I have, I think, since that first night you dragged me out of a ditch and scolded me for nearly drowning in your creek." Fen departed 2 days later, more reluctantly than his usual gruff independence typically allowed, Mustard trailing behind his cart with what Hazel privately suspected was genuine, if undignified, sadness at leaving her newfound peacock friendship behind. "You'll visit," he said, more instruction than question, gripping her hands with weathered warmth. "Whatever grand royal business keeps you occupied, girl, I expect proper visits. That cottage of yours still stands, and I intend to keep it standing, in case you ever need somewhere quieter to breathe. I will, Fen, I promise. See that you do." His stern expression softened, emotion breaking through his usual bluntness. "I'm proud of you, Hazel. Whatever your old pack once decided about your worth, you've built something more remarkable than they ever imagined possible for you." Hazel embraced him tightly, old grief for years of loneliness finally settling into gratitude rather than lingering ache. "Thank you, Fen, for everything. For checking on that fence line all those months ago, and for every kindness since." He departed with visible reluctance, Mustard bleeding what sounded suspiciously like farewell toward the distant peacock, and Hazel watched them go with settled contentment. One more piece of her old life woven into the remarkable new one she'd chosen for herself. The binding's first test arrived 3 weeks after the ceremony, when a border patrol returned to the palace with unusual news. A gathering of forest creatures, previously shy and keeping their distance from Ashvale's settled lands, had begun showing interest near the territory's eastern edge. "Not aggressive exactly," the patrol captain reported, still catching his breath. "Just curious. They've been watching the same stretch of border for 3 days now, observing our patrols rather than avoiding them, which is unusual for creatures that have kept their distance from settled lands for generations." Thorn's expression carried immediate, focused concern. "Do we know what's drawing their attention?" "No, sire, though I'd wager, given the timing, it has something to do with Lady Winmere's recent binding. The old texts mention the wilder bloodlines sometimes take notice, once a new caretaker's settled into the role." Hazel felt her stomach tighten with fresh uncertainty. "You think they're testing me somehow?" "I think," Master Aldrich said, arriving in time to catch the tail end of the report, "that Master Fen's earlier suggestion about your affinity extending beyond simple wolves may be proving accurate rather more quickly than any of us anticipated." They rode for the eastern border the following morning, Hazel accompanying Thorn despite Guard Captain Corwin's visible reluctance to bring an unproven caretaker so close to unfamiliar wildlife. "I'd rather you remain safely behind, my lady," Captain Corwin said carefully, as they approached the border's tree line. I appreciate the concern, Captain, but if this involves my binding, I'd rather face it directly than hide behind formal guard while others take the risk on my behalf. The creatures, when they finally spotted them through the trees, proved less concerning than the patrol's report had suggested. A loose gathering of forest wolves, foxes, and several older, more ancient-looking wolves, simply watching the approaching riders with quiet attention. They're waiting, Hazel murmured. Not attacking, waiting. Hazel dismounted slowly, feeling the binding's gentle pull guiding her forward. It's all right, she assured Corwin without looking back. She approached the tree line with the same patient calm she'd once used with frightened foxes and stubborn goats alike. The largest of the ancient wolves stepped forward to greet her, golden eyes, remarkably similar to Larkspur's own, studying her with gentle curiosity rather than intensity. I'm Hazel, she said softly. I'm the territory's new caretaker. I don't know what that means to you, but I promise I mean no harm to your pack, or to this forest. The wolf studied her a long moment, then, to the assembled riders' visible astonishment, dipped its great head in something unmistakably like a bow. What followed over the next hour proved more remarkable than Hazel had anticipated, a kind of wordless understanding passing between herself and the ancient wolf. Not quite language, but something deeper, conveying a sense of old sadness rather than anger, a grief about boundaries that had shifted over generations as Ashvale's lands gradually expanded. They're not hostile, she told Thorne finally. They're grieving. Old loss, old displacement, that predates either of us by generations. I think the binding's letting me understand something previous caretakers never quite managed to. What do they need from us? Understanding, mostly. And perhaps a conversation about where Ashvale's lands end and their ancestral grounds begin. The formal negotiations that followed, conducted carefully over the following weeks with Hazel serving as an unprecedented intermediary, produced a border adjustment that satisfied both settled territories' practical needs and the forest creatures' legitimate concerns. You've accomplished something no previous caretaker managed in 6 generations, Master Aldrich told her. I simply listened, Hazel said. Nobody had asked in all those generations what the forest creatures themselves actually wanted. This council spent centuries assuming those wilder bloodlines simply couldn't be reasoned with, Stern added. You proved that assumption entirely mistaken. That evening, Thorne found Hazel in Larkspur's den, watching the pups, larger now, nearly 3 months old, tumble through their evening play. I think I've stopped thinking of my differences as deficiency these past months, Hazel said. I used to believe preferring animals to people, finding more comfort in silence than in pack politics, made me lesser. I'm beginning to understand it simply made me suited for something my old pack never had occasion to witness. Something remarkable, Thorne agreed softly, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. Bramble the younger, sensing perhaps that attention had drifted away from puppy business, chose that exact moment to launch himself directly into Hazel's lap with characteristic enthusiasm, and the evening's quiet tenderness dissolved, predictably and warmly, into shared laughter. Word of the successful border negotiations spread through the wider territory within days, and Hazel found herself, over the following weeks, the subject of more formal correspondence than she'd anticipated. Letters from neighboring territories curious about the arrangement's precedent, inquiries from scholars wishing to document the wolf pack's ancient concerns, and, rather unexpectedly, a formal invitation from a distant northern territory whose own relationship with its wilder borders had grown strained over recent years. They want you to visit, Stern explained. Lord Ashworth's territory has struggled with similar tension for nearly a decade. He's asking whether Ashvale might extend some manner of diplomatic assistance, given your evident success here. That's rather a significant request for someone barely 3 months into her own binding. This council would support such a visit, should you wish to undertake it. She found Thorn in his study that evening. Lord Ashworth's requesting my assistance, she said. What do you think? I don't believe true understanding requires certainty, Hazel. I think it requires the same willingness to listen that made our own negotiation succeed. I think I'd like to try, she said finally. Not because I'm certain of success, but because I'd rather attempt help and risk failure than decline simply because uncertainty frightens me. That's precisely the answer I hoped you'd reach, Thorn said, something proud and warm in his expression. Hazel smiled, reaching across the desk to take his offered hand, already turning over the possibilities this unexpected new responsibility might bring. Proof, once again, that the unlikely path that had begun with a drowning wolf in a rain-soaked ditch continued unfolding into something more remarkable than she'd ever allowed herself to imagine wanting. The journey north took the better part of a week, Hazel traveling with a modest party consisting of Thorn, Captain Corwin, and Master Aldrich, whose scholarly interest in documenting the Northern Territory's concerns had proven more enthusiastic than his aging joints appreciated after 5 days of hard riding. I confess, I'm rather looking forward to a proper bed, he admitted, wincing as he dismounted at their final evening's camp. Scholarships more comfortable conducted from a library chair than a saddle. Thorn, settling beside Hazel near their small campfire once the horses were tended, studied her thoughtful expression with attention. You're nervous. Considerably. Our own negotiation succeeded, certainly, but I confess I'm not certain the same approach will translate to a decade's worth of accumulated tension, rather than simple generations-old grievance our own borders carried. You won't know until you try. Though I'd remind you, whatever the outcome, you're not attempting this alone. Lord Ashworth's territory, when they finally arrived, carried a more guarded atmosphere than Ashvale's borders. Patrol guards stationed with careful attention along the tree line, and the forest itself feeling watchful and uncertain rather than openly hostile. Lady Winmere, thank you for making this journey, Lord Ashworth said, a weathered, anxious man whose formal composure carried visible strain. I confess I'm not certain what solution you might offer that a decade of failed diplomatic attempts hasn't exhausted. I can't promise success, Lord Ashworth. I can only promise effort, and honest attention to whatever grievance drives this tension. The following morning, Hazel approached the northern border and found herself understanding, with sudden clarity, exactly what drove their fear. There was a terrible misunderstanding, she said quietly, emerging from the wordless exchange. 3 years passed. Lord Ashworth's predecessor made a devastating decision, believing the forest bloodline responsible for livestock losses that later proved to be ordinary predator activity. Many of the bloodline were lost before the mistake was understood. Thorn's expression grew somber. This isn't a negotiation about boundaries, Hazel continued. It's an entire bloodline's deep fear that settled lands might harm them again. She brought this understanding back to Lord Ashworth. I knew about what happened, he admitted. I didn't understand how deeply that tragedy still shaped their continued distrust. Time alone rarely heals wounds that deep, Lord Ashworth, not without acknowledgement and demonstrated change. What would you suggest? A formal apology, public acknowledgement, delivered directly to the pack's leaders. Beyond that, clear protocols for investigating future livestock losses before any action is taken, with the pack's own representatives included in the conversation. The formal apology, delivered 3 days later, proved more challenging than Hazel's own negotiation, met initially with understandable caution, old wounds not easily healed by ceremony alone. This will take time, Hazel told him afterward. Trust rebuilds slowly, particularly after harm this deep. You're remarkably patient, Lady Winmere. I've had practice with patience. Animals don't respond well to rushed trust. I imagine wounded packs operate by similar principle. They remained nearly 3 weeks, working carefully to establish the new protocols, and by their departure, progress had taken root. I won't pretend full trust has been restored, Hazel told Lord Ashworth. But I believe the foundation's now laid for healing to continue. I intend to maintain it, Lady Winmere. Whatever it costs, I won't repeat my predecessor's mistake. Thorne found her that evening. You did something remarkable here, more difficult than our own negotiation, given the depth of tragedy involved. I simply applied what I'd already learned. Listen first. Acknowledge wrong before proposing solution. Remain patient rather than rushing toward premature resolution. They departed the following morning, and 3 days later, Ashvale's familiar towers finally rose into view. Home, Thorne said. Home, Hazel agreed, feeling the words settle with complete rightness. Not simply the territory itself, but everything it now contained. Larkspur and her grown pups, Bramble's practical friendship, Stern's hard-won respect, and Thorne's steady partnership through every challenge this new life continued bringing. The pups, now nearly 4 months old and more coordinated than their earlier tumbling chaos had suggested possible, greeted their return with enthusiastic welcome. Larkspur herself pressing close against Hazel's legs, with evident relieved delight at her caretaker's safe homecoming. They've grown, even in 3 weeks, Hazel said, laughing as Bramble the younger attempted an ambitious, unsuccessful leap toward her shoulder. I missed this place, Hazel admitted, settling onto the familiar garden wall overlooking Larkspur's den, watching the pups resume their evening play. Ashworth's territory needed help, certainly, and I'm grateful for whatever progress we managed there. But this? She gestured at the familiar den, the settling evening light, Thorne's steady presence beside her. This is home, in every sense that words ever meant. That evening, with the pups finally settled, Thorne drew Hazel close as they watched the stars emerge over Ashvale's familiar hills. I've been thinking about what this journey revealed, not simply about diplomacy or old grievances healing, but about you. About what you're capable of when given opportunity to use your gifts. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that whatever work still waits ahead, I'd like to support it however I can. Not simply as your husband someday, should that day arrive, but as partner in whatever purpose you continue building. Hazel felt her breath catch at the careful weight in his words. That sounds rather like a proposal, Thorne, dressed up in diplomatic language. Perhaps it is, though I confess I'd rather ask you properly, when the moment feels right, rather than stumbling into it accidentally after a long journey. I'll hold you to that asking then, Hazel said, smiling as she leaned into his shoulder, watching Ashvale's peaceful evening settle around them. Though I'll admit, whenever that moment arrives, I suspect you already know what my answer will be. Thorne's answering laugh, warm and genuine, carried across the quiet garden, and Hazel, settling into his embrace beneath the strengthening stars, she wouldn't trade a single moment of the unlikely path that had led her here. The weeks following their return from Ashworth's territory settled into a rhythm Hazel found herself treasuring more each day. Mornings spent with Larkspur's now independent pups, afternoons handling the stream of correspondence that had begun arriving from other territories curious about her diplomatic success, and evenings that increasingly, without any planning, found her and Thorne discussing everything from formal territorial policy to the pup's latest chaotic misadventures. Bramble the younger's escaped his den again, Bramble reported one morning, arriving with visible exasperation. Third time this week, I found him in the kitchen, apparently investigating whether the ovens contained anything edible. He takes after mustard, I think, Hazel said, laughing despite herself. Old Fenn's goat has similar opinions about which spaces belong to her. Wonderful. I look forward to managing an entire pack with goat-adjacent boundary opinions. Despite the good-natured chaos, Hazel found herself, over these settling weeks, increasingly aware of a tension building beneath Thorne's usual warm composure. Moments where he seemed on the verge of saying something significant before visibly reconsidering. small, distracted pauses during otherwise ordinary conversation that suggested planning occupying his thoughts. "You're plotting something," she told him directly, one evening in Larkspur's den, watching him startle slightly at her observation. "I don't know what you mean." "Thorn, I've spent months learning to read subtle behavioral cues in creatures less expressive than you currently are. You're plotting something, and rather poorly concealing it." He laughed, something sheepish crossing his features. "I suppose I'm not as skilled at concealment as formal diplomatic training should have taught me." "What are you plotting?" "You'll simply have to wait and discover it, whenever the moment finally feels right." The moment, as it happened, arrived rather unexpectedly 2 weeks later, during what should have been an ordinary afternoon spent walking the territory's eastern border to check on the renewed peace with the forest pack. They'd stopped near the same clearing where Hazel had first communicated with the ancient wolf leader months earlier, and Thorn, rather than continuing their usual patrol pace, had settled onto a fallen log with visible purpose. "I've been thinking," he said, "about waiting for a grander, more ceremonial moment. A formal garden, perhaps, with advanced planning and appropriate romantic staging." "That sounds rather unlike you." "It does, doesn't it? I think that's precisely why I've abandoned the plan." He reached into his coat, producing a small, carefully wrapped bundle that made Hazel's breath catch immediately. "I'd rather ask you here, where this entire partnership first began. Not simply between us, but between you and this territory, this forest, everything you've built these past months through patience and kindness." Hazel felt her heart hammer against her ribs, old caution entirely dissolved into breathless anticipation. "Thorn, let me say this, please, before nerves overtake my words." He unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing a ring set with a stone the exact golden color of both his own eyes and Larkspur's, catching the afternoon light with warm significance. "I fell in love with you somewhere between that midnight doorstep and this clearing, Hazel. I've watched you transform not simply this territory's fortune, but my own understanding of what partnership means. I don't want to simply support whatever purpose you continue building. I want to build it alongside you, as your husband, for whatever remains of both our lives." He knelt, the ring held carefully between them, golden eyes carrying the same steady warmth she'd first glimpsed on her own modest doorstep all those months earlier. "Will you marry me, Hazel? Not simply as Ashvale's king, but as the man who's watched you accomplish more good in a few short months than 6 generations of previous caretakers managed combined?" Hazel felt tears spill over before she'd managed any words at all. 3 years of solitude and old rejection finally giving way to something she'd stopped believing herself capable of feeling again. "Yes," she managed finally, voice thick with emotion. "Yes, obviously yes. Though I confess I hadn't prepared for quite this much sincerity on an ordinary border patrol." Thorn's answering laugh, relieved and joyful, carried across the quiet clearing as he slid the ring onto her trembling finger, before pulling her into an embrace that lifted her off her feet entirely. "I love you," he murmured against her hair, more than formal words managed to express. "I love you too," Hazel said, laughing through her own happy tears. "Though I'll admit, this clearing holds rather significant memory now, beyond simply the Wolfpack's negotiation." "I rather hoped it might," Thorn said, something warm and satisfied in his expression. "I wanted our engagement tied to the place where I first witnessed exactly what capability you carried. Not simply gentleness with frightened creatures, but courage facing down old fear and grief that most people would have avoided entirely." They rode back toward the palace later than their patrol had required, both wearing matching happiness that Captain Corwin noticed immediately upon their return, his usually stern expression breaking into delight at the ring now visible on Hazel's hand. "Finally," he said, something approving in his voice, "I confess the entire household staff's been placing quiet wagers on when His Majesty would work up sufficient courage." "You had wagers?" Thorn asked, mock offended. "Considerable wagers, sire. I believe Bramble won the pool, having correctly guessed the eastern clearing as the proper location. Bramble herself arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion, and let out a delighted laugh upon spotting the ring. "I knew it. I told Stern weeks ago you'd choose somewhere significant rather than following formal court tradition." "You wagered on my proposal location," Thorne said, something between amusement and embarrassment crossing his expression. "Everyone wagered on your proposal location, sire. You've been transparently smitten these past several months. It seemed only reasonable to monetize the anticipation." Larkspur, sensing the household's excitement, wandered over from her den with placid curiosity, and Hazel knelt to share the news, feeling the wolf's warm breath against her hand as she studied the ring with wordless interest. "We're getting married," Hazel told her softly. "Formally, whatever elaborate ceremony this household apparently already has planned." Larkspur's tail thumped once, warm and approving, and the pups, sensing their mother's contentment, tumbled over to investigate the ring themselves with typical enthusiasm. "They approve," Thorne observed, watching Bramble the Younger attempt to sniff the ring before losing interest entirely in favor of chasing his own tail. "They approve of anything involving attention," Hazel corrected, laughing as she scooped the wriggling pup into her arms. "Though I confess I'm rather glad regardless. Their approval feels significant, given everything they've come to mean to me these past months." News of the engagement spread through the territory within days, faster than either of them anticipated, and Hazel found herself, over the following week, the recipient of an outpouring of goodwill from villagers, council members, and household staff alike. Small gifts left at the palace gates, congratulatory letters from neighboring territories, and, rather touchingly, a small delegation of village children who'd apparently walked considerable distance simply to present her with a bouquet of wildflowers they'd gathered themselves. "You've become beloved this past year," Bramble observed, watching Hazel accept the children's gift with visible emotion. "I don't believe any previous caretaker earned quite this level of village-wide affection. I think it's simply that they've watched the difference this binding's made, rather than experiencing it as distant prophecy. Better harvests along the border regions, safer travel through forest paths, peace where tension once existed. Modesty aside, I'd wager it's more about you personally than simply the binding's practical benefits. People recognize kindness, Hazel, particularly when it's demonstrated consistently, rather than performed for formal occasion." Old Fen arrived a week later, having apparently heard the news through whatever remarkable gossip network connected his isolated farm to more distant territories, Mustard trotting along beside his cart with her usual stubborn disregard for the journey's length. "Well," he announced, taking in Hazel's evident happiness with weathered satisfaction. "I suppose congratulations are in order, girl, though I confess I'm not surprised, given how smitten that king looked the first time I found him sitting in your kitchen at midnight." "I missed you, Fen." Hazel embraced him warmly, delight at his familiar presence. "Missed you too, though this territory's clearly kept you occupied with matters more significant than an old farmer's fence line." Fen's expression softened, pride breaking through his usual bluntness. "I'm proud of you, Hazel. Whatever your old pack once decided about your worth, I hope they eventually hear how remarkably you've proven them wrong." "I've stopped needing their acknowledgement," Hazel said, surprising herself with how completely true the words felt. "I think that's perhaps the most significant thing this past year's taught me. My worth was never dependent on their approval to begin with." That evening, once Fen had settled into his familiar guest quarters and Mustard had been separated from her new peacock companion for the night, Hazel found herself once more in the quiet garden, this time with both Thorne and Fen for company, watching the stars strengthen overhead. "You'll need a wedding date," Fen observed, settling onto the garden bench with a contented sigh. "I don't intend to travel this distance twice, so plan accordingly." "Marchioness Aldwyn's already begun drafting proposals, apparently," Thorne said, something rueful in his expression. "I confess I'm rather terrified of what elaborate scale she's currently envisioning." "Whatever scale it takes," Hazel said, leaning contentedly into Thorn's shoulder. "I only ask that Larkspur and the pups attend. And Mustard, provided she agrees not to eat anything ceremonially significant." "No promises," Fen said cheerfully, and the three of them settled into easy laughter beneath Ashvale's peaceful evening sky. Before finally retiring for the night, Hazel lingered a moment longer at the garden's edge, watching Larkspur's den settle into darkness, the pups' small forms curled contentedly against their mother's warmth. "I keep thinking," she told Thorn quietly, "about how frightened I was that first night, dragging you out of the ditch without any idea what I was pulling into my life. And now? Now I find myself unable to imagine a version of my life that doesn't include all of this. The pups, this garden, Fen's ridiculous goat, and you." She smiled up at him, Ring catching the last of the evening's fading light. "I think that's rather the most remarkable transformation of all. Not the binding, not the diplomacy, not even the engagement. Simply learning that a life this full was ever possible for someone like me." "Someone like you," Thorn repeated softly. "Deserved this all along, Hazel. I'm only grateful fate arranged matters so that I got to witness you claiming it." They stood together a while longer in the quiet dark, the territory settling peacefully around them, before finally turning back toward the palace and whatever remarkable future still waited to unfold. Marchioness Aldwyn, when Hazel finally met her the following week, proved to be a brisk, formidable woman whose reputation for meticulous ceremonial planning had apparently spread beyond Ashvale's own borders. "Lady Winmere," she said, sweeping into the palace's formal receiving room with an armful of scrolls that suggested weeks of preparation already underway. "I confess I've been rather looking forward to this meeting, a royal wedding, and one with such a remarkable origin story besides. I intend to do the occasion justice. I appreciate your enthusiasm, Marchioness, though I confess I'd rather the ceremony remain modest, given my own background." "That's remarkably sensible, actually," Aldwyn said, softening. "I've overseen 4 previous royal weddings, and I confess the grandest of them rarely felt meaningful to the couples actually exchanging vows, buried as they were beneath centuries of accumulated expectation. We could hold the formal public ceremony here, satisfying whatever political obligation your position requires," Aldwyn proposed. "But perhaps a smaller, more private exchange could happen elsewhere. Somewhere significant to you both." "The Eastern Clearing?" Hazel said immediately, "where Thorn proposed. Where I first spoke with the Wolfpack's leader." "I'd suggest inviting the Wolfpack's own leadership to witness." Hazel approached the border personally to extend the invitation, finding the ancient wolf leader waiting with what seemed, even through their wordless communication, like anticipation. "I'm to be married," she explained. "I'd be honored if your pack would witness the private exchange, given how significant this territory's peace with your own bloodline has become to me." The wolf dipped its great head in the same formal bow it had offered during their first meeting. "I never understood," Hazel admitted to Bramble one exhausted afternoon, "quite how much labor goes into a single day's celebration. You've managed to negotiate international tension, calm a difficult wolf birth, and earn this entire territory's affection, all within a single year. I suspect wedding planning falls well within your capability." It was Stern, unexpectedly, who provided the suggestion that finally eased Hazel's remaining anxiety. "You could invite representatives from Ashworth's territory," he proposed. "It would demonstrate this territory's commitment to the kind of diplomatic partnership you've begun building, while offering you familiar faces amid unfamiliar formal grandeur." Lord Ashworth, upon receiving the invitation, responded with grateful enthusiasm. During one particularly demanding afternoon of formal fittings, Hazel found herself overcome with sudden emotion, old grief for her original pack's rejection resurfacing amid all this celebration. Thorn found her afterward in Larkspur's den. "What happened?" I simply found myself thinking about how different this all is from what I once believed my life would become. My old pack, they'd have called this entire turn impossible. Grief doesn't always arrive on convenient timelines, Thorn said softly. You're allowed to feel both things, joy about our wedding and grief about what your old pack cost you. Neither feeling diminishes the other's validity. I love you precisely because you feel things honestly, he added, rather than performing whatever emotion circumstance seems to demand. The final weeks brought a flurry of arriving guests, including Lord Ashworth's delegation, a full week early. The Northern Forest bloodline's fear has eased, Lord Ashworth reported. Not entirely resolved, but more trusting than when you first arrived. Master Aldrich, arriving with his usual scholarly enthusiasm, brought news that added fresh dimension to the wedding's weight. I've been researching the prophecy's full historical record, he explained. It seems the binding's original prophecy specifically anticipated a caretaker whose personal history included rejection and displacement, believed by the earliest scholars to be essential to the empathy required for the role's full potential. You're saying the prophecy anticipated someone like me specifically, Hazel said slowly. Whatever your old pack once decided about your worth, this territory's founding prophecy essentially predicted that exact rejection would prove essential to producing precisely the caretaker Ashvale most needed. Your history isn't simply something you overcame to arrive here. It's the qualification that made your arrival here possible. Hazel felt tears threaten again, though these carried none of her earlier grief's heaviness, simply grateful wonder. Thorn reached for her hand once Master Aldrich had departed. I hope you'll believe that now, that your history was never simply obstacle overcome, but foundation for everything remarkable you've since built. I think I finally do, Hazel said, resting her head against his shoulder as the study's quiet afternoon light settled warmly around them. Truly, completely, for the first time since my old pack first taught me otherwise. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, spring sunshine breaking gold across Ashvale's towers in a way that struck Hazel. Dressing with the careful assistance of a maid marchioness Aldwyn had assigned specifically for the occasion, as more significant than any ordinary morning had felt in longer than she could remember. You look radiant, my lady, the maid said, adjusting the final details of a gown finer than anything Hazel had ever imagined wearing during her 3 solitary years of survival. I don't feel radiant, Hazel admitted, studying her own reflection with a mixture of nervous anticipation and wonder. Mostly I feel rather like I might float away from sheer feeling if someone doesn't keep me anchored to the ground. Bramble found her shortly after, carrying a small wrapped bundle she presented with uncharacteristic nervousness. I wanted to give you something, she said, before the ceremony begins. Hazel unwrapped the bundle carefully, finding inside a small, carved wooden figure of a wolf, remarkably detailed despite its modest size. I carved it myself, Bramble admitted, something almost shy in her usual brisk demeanor. I wanted you to have something marking how this whole year began. A drowning wolf, and a stranger's kindness. You've become rather important to me this past year, Bramble said gruffly. I wanted you to know that, before you're formally married and too grand for simple household healers to bother anymore. I'll never be too grand for that, Bramble. I promise you that. The formal public ceremony, held in the palace's great hall, unfolded with the particular grandeur Marchioness Aldwyn's planning had assembled. Banners in Ashvale's colors, formally dressed attendees filling row after row, and at the chamber's center, waiting with visible joy, stood Thorn. Captain Corwin escorted her down the aisle, formal in a way she'd never quite witnessed from the usually practical guard captain. The formal vows carried a weight Hazel hadn't anticipated. I now pronounce you king and queen, the elder announced, and the great hall erupted into thunderous celebration as Thorn pulled her into a kiss that carried more emotion than formal ceremony typically permitted. But it was the private ceremony, held at dusk in the eastern clearing where Thorn had first proposed, That carried the day's truest weight. Only a small gathering attended. Bramble, Stern, Master Aldrich, Old Fen with Mustard trotting beside him, and, watching from the tree line's edge, the ancient wolf leader alongside several members of the forest pack. Larkspur herself lay curled nearby with her grown pups, watching the proceedings with placid satisfaction. "I love you," Thorn said, their hands joined beneath the same darkening sky that had witnessed his proposal months earlier. "Not simply the queen you'll formally become, but you, the woman who pulled a drowning wolf from freezing mud without any idea what chaos that single act of kindness would bring." "I love you too," Hazel said, voice thick with emotion. "The king who couldn't explain himself at midnight, who trusted me with Larkspur's care before I'd earned any claim to trust." Larkspur rose from her resting spot and pressed her great head gently against both their joined hands, and the gathered witnesses offered quiet applause. The ancient wolf leader dipped its great head one final time in what Hazel understood, without need for words, as blessing upon their union. "Thank you," Hazel murmured to Larkspur, kneeling briefly to embrace the wolf who had brought this entire life into being, for getting stuck in that ditch all those months ago. Bramble the Younger attempted an ambitious leap toward Hazel's formal wedding attire. "He has absolutely no respect for ceremony," Fen observed. "He has enormous respect for ceremony," Hazel corrected, laughing. "He simply believes affection is an integral component of any proper celebration." Fen approached her one final time. "I'm proud of you, girl. Whatever your old pack once decided about your worth, I hope word eventually reaches them about the woman you've become." Stern found her shortly after. "I confess, watching today's proceedings, I find myself satisfied that this territory's prophecy found precisely the caretaker it required." It was near midnight, the small private celebration finally winding toward its conclusion, that Hazel found herself alone with Thorn once more. "How does it feel?" Thorn asked. "Formally married now?" "I think I understood, the moment you first proposed here, that the truest commitment had already formed between us. Today, simply let this entire chosen family witness what we already knew." "Welcome home, Hazel," he said, "for whatever remarkable years await us both." 2 years later, Ashvale's continued prosperity had become something of a quiet legend throughout the surrounding territories. Border tensions resolved through patient diplomacy, 3 additional territories having sought Hazel's counsel, and the palace filled with the warm chaos of an ever-expanding pack of grown wolves alongside their own small, growing family. Larkspur's original 5 pups had matured into strong, distinct adults. Old Fen visited regularly, Mustard having long since abandoned goat behavior in favor of peacock companionship, and Stern remained one of Hazel's most trusted advisors. "Regrets?" Thorn asked one quiet evening. "Not a single one," Hazel said, watching the sunset paint Ashvale's peaceful hills in familiar gold, "though I confess I never imagined, pulling a drowning wolf from that ditch, that I'd end up here." "The very best kind," Hazel said, smiling as Larkspur wandered over to settle at their feet, exactly as she had that first remarkable evening. Exactly the kind worth pulling out of a ditch and keeping forever. Bramble the Younger, now nearly grown but never quite outgrowing his fondness for undignified affection, wandered over as well, pressing his weight against Hazel's legs until she relented and scratched behind his ears one final time before the evening's quiet settled around them. "Some things," Thorn observed, "never change." "I rather hope not," Hazel said softly, leaning into her husband's shoulder as the last light faded over Ashvale's hills. The whole remarkable family gathered close around them. "I find I wouldn't trade a single piece of this particular chaos, whatever shape it continues taking, for anything else in the world. If this story found its way into your heart, the drowning wolf, the midnight proposal, the ancient pack's hard-won trust, I'd love to hear which part stayed with you. And if you're hungry for another tale of unlikely rescues and hard-won love, just say the word."